Let's dive into the very first account of Jesus' life ever written, the Gospel of Mark. But we're not just going to read it. Oh no. We're going behind the scenes to find the real human story, the pretty surprising author, and the absolutely brilliant structure that makes this ancient book tick.
So, right off the bat, you gotta know this. The author never actually names himself. In fact, none of the gospel writers do. And that's on purpose. It's their way of saying, hey, don't look at me, look at him. The spotlight is meant to be entirely on Jesus.
So if he didn't sign his name, how in the world do we figure out who wrote it? Well, we have to become detectives. We've got to look for clues, little breadcrumbs left behind in the text and in the memory of the early church. And our very first clue? It's a really strange, very human nickname.
Early tradition is pretty clear that the author was a man named John Mark. And what's so cool is that this guy had 3 names, each from a totally different culture. He had Marcus, his Latin name, which hints at Roman connections. He had Yohanan, his Hebrew name, and then he had this Greek nickname, Kolobodactylus.
And what does that Greek nickname mean? Get this, stubby-fingered. Just stop and think about that for a second. The very first gospel ever written, the foundational story of Jesus, came from a guy who was known for a physical imperfection. It's just this powerful reminder that God doesn't wait for perfect people. He uses who's available, flaws and all.
Okay, so we have our author, but was he actually there? Was the stubby-fingered man an eyewitness to the incredible events he describes? Well, that leads us to our next clue, and it's a really weird detail, hidden in a moment of total crisis.
Only Mark's gospel includes this bizarre, kind of embarrassing detail. When Jesus gets arrested, some young guy who followed him there completely panics, bolts, and runs away naked, leaving his only clothes behind. I mean, why would you include that? Well, most scholars think it's Mark's subtle signature, his own little cameo, his way of saying, yep, I was there, I was that kid.
But here's the thing you have to understand about Mark. He was never the main guy. He was always number 2, an assistant. He served his cousin Barnabas, he served the Apostle Paul, and most importantly for our story, he served the Apostle Peter. And that role is the key to this entire book.
Right, so this role as a helper and interpreter is everything. See, tradition tells us that when Peter, the big, impulsive fisherman, was preaching in Rome, he had a problem. He didn't speak Latin, but the Romans did. So who stepped in? Mark. Mark translated Peter's sermons on the fly. And eventually, the Roman Christians begged him, please write all this down for us. So this book, the Gospel of Mark, it's really the Gospel according to Peter.
And you can totally feel Peter's personality all over this gospel. He was a man of action, right? Not long philosophical speeches. And look at the result. Mark's account is just jam-packed with 18 different miracles, but only 4 parables. It's fast-paced, it's urgent, it's all about what Jesus did, which is exactly how Peter would have told it.
But you know, the strongest proof that this is Peter's story might be his brutal honesty about himself. He makes sure Mark includes his absolute worst moments, Jesus calling him Satan, his cowardly triple denial of Christ. But what does he leave out? The moments of high praise. He omits Jesus saying, "On this rock I will build my church." Peter just wasn't interested in making himself look good. He just wanted to tell the truth.
Okay, so we've got the who behind the story. Now let's look at the how. Because Mark didn't just jot down stories at random. No way. He carefully shaped them into a deliberate journey. A hike, really, an ascent to a dramatic turning point.
The whole story starts at literally the lowest point on earth, the Jordan River. From there, it moves uphill into Galilee, and Jesus' popularity just explodes. The journey keeps climbing, both on the map and in its meaning, until it reaches this crucial watershed moment. And from there, everything starts its final descent down toward Jerusalem and the cross.
Mark actually breaks down that first big climb into 3 phases. First, there's acclamation. Jesus is a rock star. Then comes opposition, as the religious leaders start to really push back. And finally, there's concentration. Jesus pulls away from the huge crowds to focus everything on his 12 disciples, getting them ready for what's coming next.
And that what's next, that climax, it all happens at a place called Caesarea Philippi. And believe me, the location was no accident. This place was a major center for pagan worship. It had a shrine for Pan, who was a mythical god as man, and a giant temple honoring Caesar, who was a man as god.
So it's right here, surrounded by all these competing ideas about God and man, that Jesus finally asks the question he's been building towards for over 2 years. First he asks, who do people say that I am? And the answers are all over the place. A prophet, maybe John the Baptist come back to life, basically total confusion.
But then, he makes it personal. He turns the question directly to his inner circle, his closest friends. He looks at these men he's been pouring his life into for years and asks, "But who do you say that I am?"
And Peter, good old impulsive, action-oriented Peter, nails it. You are the Christ.
Boom, that's it.
That is the watershed moment. It's the key that unlocks the entire second half of the whole story.
And with that one confession, what scholars call the Messianic Secret is finally over. For 2.5 years, Jesus had been telling people, "Shh, keep it quiet, don't tell anyone who I am." But now that his disciples finally get who he is, he can start explaining why he came, to build his church and to suffer and die. But this brings us to the final and maybe the biggest mystery of Mark's gospel, its ending. Because the oldest, most reliable copies of this book we have, well, they have a shockingly abrupt and, frankly, unsettling conclusion.
That's it. That's how the very first gospel originally ended. The women find the empty tomb, an angel tells them Jesus is risen, and they run away in terror. They said nothing to anyone for they were afraid. Full stop. The end. Just silence.
Which, of course, leaves us with a huge question. Why? Why would the gospel, a word that literally means good news, end not with a celebration, but with fear and silence? I mean, it's a question that has baffled people for centuries.
Well, there are basically three main theories. Some think Mark did it on purpose as a sort of literary challenge to the reader. Others suggest he was interrupted, maybe arrested, or even killed while writing during Nero's persecution in Rome. But the view most scholars hold today is that the final page of the original scroll was just lost to history.
We do know that later scribes were so uncomfortable with this massive cliffhanger that they actually added the longer endings that we see in most of our Bibles today. They just wanted to tie it all up with a neat bow to give the story a more satisfying, conclusive finish. But, maybe there's a real power in that original unfinished ending. It kind of forces the story right off the ancient page and into our lives, doesn't it? Mark gives us the empty tomb. He gives us the angel's announcement, and then he just stops. He leaves us with a question. The story is unfinished. It's waiting for a response. So, what's yours?